Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We've got a pretty fascinating set of questions to explore today.
Yeah, it's like almost a blueprint for kind of examining how we operate, both as individuals and within, these bigger systems and structures.
Right, not just these kind of abstract ideas, but stuff that really impacts how we interact with each other and how we understand, like, the forces that shape our world.
Absolutely. And what really struck us about the material you sent was, it's this incredible breadth. It goes from like very personal reflections on our relationships to tackling these really complex questions of ethics and justice on like a societal level.
It's a pretty ambitious undertaking, and we're not going to pretend to have all the answers. I mean, so much of this stuff is nuanced and open to
Yeah.
interpretation, right? But our aim is to sort of unpack these ideas with you, maybe offer up some new angles to think about.
Yeah, consider it kind of shared exploration, us navigating these important concepts right alongside you. And for context, this deep dive is inspired by a piece called Questions to Ponder, a reflective podcast experience, which kind of lays the groundwork for the kind of critical thinking we're going to be doing.
So let's start with this first layer, which is all about how we view ourselves and our interactions with others. And the material jumps right in with these two really direct questions. How have I treated others? And how do people outside my social circle perceive me?
Those are some pretty powerful starting points, right? They force you to look back on your past interactions, not just what you intended,
Yeah.
but what the actual impact of your words and actions might have been. It's kind of like a call for honest self-assessment.
Yeah, and it's easy to get caught up in our intentions, thinking that, like, if we meant well, everything's good. But, taking that extra step to consider how things landed on the receiving end, especially after the fact, can be super insightful, even uncomfortable sometimes. It can help you spot, like, patterns in your behavior and, figure out what you can learn from past experiences.
And it's really valuable to think about how people outside your close circle of friends and family perceive you. Because those closest to us often have a more forgiving or like biased view. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So considering how colleagues, acquaintances, even just people you encounter briefly might see you, can give you a broader and maybe even more accurate sense of how you come across.
Yeah, like a more panoramic view of your social footprint.
Exactly, a panoramic view.
Yeah. So moving into some trickier territory now, the material you sent brings up the question of sensitivity training for racial bias. And the heart of the issue here is, does this kind of training actually lead to real lasting change? Or is it more about teaching people how to appear less biased, at least on the surface?
Right. And there's no easy answer to that. There's research that suggests sensitivity training can raise awareness and give people tools for more inclusive behavior. But there's also evidence that it might not actually shift deeply ingrained beliefs. And it can even backfire sometimes, creating resentment or like a very superficial adoption of inclusive language.
So it really raises this question of, like, are we getting to the root of the problem, or are we just addressing the symptoms?
Exactly.
Okay, then we get to another super sensitive topic. The idea of rehabilitation for individuals who've committed sexual offenses. And the question posed is, straight up, is real change even possible through intervention and training? I mean, this brings up a whole bunch of ethical and logistical challenges.
It certainly does. I mean, you're dealing with, really entrenched behaviors
Hmm.
and the absolute need to ensure public safety,
Right.
right? And the research on the effectiveness of interventions for sexual offenders is mixed, to say the least. Factors like the individual's motivation to change, the type and intensity of therapy they receive, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or like relapse prevention programs, and the support systems they have in place after treatment, all those things play a huge role.
So we're not talking about easy fixes here, right? These are really complex issues with no simple solutions.
Right.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about power dynamics and social justice. One of the first questions that jumps out is, are positions of power occupied solely to serve the interests of the powerful? Now, that's a pretty bold statement, but I think it resonates with a lot of people's experiences, just observing how things work in the real world.
It is a bold statement, and it makes you think about the core motivations of people in authority.
Mm.
Are their decisions driven by a genuine desire to serve the greater good? Or are they mainly focused on preserving their own power and privilege? And the truth is, it's probably a mix,
Yeah.
right?
Like a spectrum.
Right, a spectrum, and understanding where individuals and institutions fall on that spectrum is crucial for evaluating accountability and addressing systemic inequalities.
Mm.
Because if self-interest is the driving force, then strong checks and balances become even more vital.
Absolutely. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The material then asks, How can good individuals defend themselves against malevolent practices? So we're moving from like examining the motivations of the powerful to empowering those who are facing unethical behavior. What can they do?
Right. It's about individual agency in the face of wrongdoing.
Hmm.
What are the tools, resources, strategies that people can use when they're up against injustice or corruption or abuse of power? That could involve things like understanding their legal rights, using whistleblowing mechanisms if they exist, forming support networks, documenting any evidence of wrongdoing, or even just recognizing potentially harmful situations and, getting out of them.
It's about being equipped, right, to navigate a world where, let's face it, not everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly.
Okay, and then the material turns its attention to the legal system itself, asking, can the legal system enact meaningful change? It's a really fundamental question about the potential for laws and legal structures to, truly promote justice.
It forces you to think about the capacity of those systems, right?
Yeah.
To really address societal problems and make things more equitable. Are there inherent limitations in how they're structured or how they're implemented that might prevent them from reaching their goals, achieving what they're supposed to achieve? And we know there are issues like unequal access to legal resources or biases within the system itself that can impact its effectiveness.
Right, which takes us to the next very related question. Is the legal system broken, or is it the people within it who perpetuate corruption? It's like, is the tool itself flawed, or is it the way it's being used?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Is the problem with the design of the system, its laws, its procedures, its institutions, or is it with the people operating within it? Folks who might be prioritizing their own gain or acting unethically and undermining its integrity. Figuring out where the breakdown is happening is essential for figuring out how to fix it.
Mm.
If the system itself is flawed, then we need systemic changes. If the issue is with the individuals, then we need to focus on ethics and accountability and better oversight.
So, identifying the source of the problem is key to coming up with effective solutions. Okay, the next question is, can oppressive behavior drive good people to their limits? This really shifts the focus to the human impact of all these, bigger systemic issues.
It really does. This question is about the psychological toll of experiencing or witnessing oppression, whether it's discrimination, bullying, abuse of power. Even people with a strong moral compass and a ton of resilience can be deeply affected by constant injustice. It makes you think about those breaking points, the potential for burnout, and how critical support systems and coping mechanisms are for those facing prolonged adversity.
Yeah, it's a reminder that everyone has their limits. Even the most resilient folks can be impacted by negative environments and, sustained exposure to oppression. Okay, let's dive into the next section, which looks at strategies and narratives. The first question is, are there strategic plans in place for both malevolent and benevolent individuals? It's interesting, the idea that both good and bad actions could be the result of intentional planning, long-term strategies.
It is interesting. It suggests that both ethical and unethical actors could be operating with specific goals and plans. So benevolent plans might be focused on things like collaboration and transparency and collective well-being, while malevolent plans could involve deception and manipulation and, exploiting people's vulnerabilities.
So it's about recognizing that different types of intentionality might be driving the actions we see.
Exactly.
Okay, then we get this question. Do businesses have ethical frameworks that differentiate between good and evil practices? This really gets to the heart of a company's values and, its operating principles.
Right. It's crucial for understanding how businesses behave. Do they have clear ethical guidelines that go beyond just following the law? And do those stated missions and values actually translate into ethical behavior in practice? Or are they mainly for show? Digging into how companies define their purpose and draw the line between what's acceptable and what's not tells you a lot about their real impact on society.
Yeah, it's about looking beyond the PR, right, and trying to understand the true ethical structure or lack thereof within an organization. Okay, the final part of the material you sent focuses on this vocabulary reflection, and it's all about these terms that describe the power dynamic between people in positions of authority and, average everyday folks. Let's take these one by one. The first one is disregard, which the source says basically reflects a lack of value placed on individual worth, leading to systemic neglect.
Right, and a good example of that would be when policies are made without considering the impact on vulnerable populations.
Right, like when the needs and rights of certain groups are just ignored or overlooked.
Exactly. When those in power operate with that kind of disregard, it can lead to policies and practices that, either don't consider or actually harm those with less power. And that can lead to, like, a sense of dehumanization and reinforce existing inequalities.
Okay, then we have dismissed, which the source describes as the experience of having your voice ignored, feeling like your input doesn't matter in decision-making processes. And I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a really disempowering feeling.
Hmm.
Feeling dismissed signals that your voice isn't valued, your concerns aren't legitimate, your perspective doesn't matter, and that can erode trust in institutions and in leaders. It can make people feel alienated and powerless.
The next term is unchecked, which the source defines as the failure to monitor or control unethical actions. This really gets at the importance of accountability, making sure that power isn't being abused.
Right, when there's no oversight, when there are no effective mechanisms for accountability, the potential for abuse just skyrockets. Without checks and balances, unethical behavior can become so widespread that it starts to feel normal, like just part of the system.
And then we have cover up, which, unfortunately we see a lot of. It's the deliberate concealment of misconduct, which, obviously damages trust in both institutions and individuals.
And it breeds cynicism, right? It
Yeah.
makes people distrustful.
Yeah.
When wrongdoing is intentionally hidden, it undermines the credibility of everyone involved. It sends the message that protecting reputations is more important than upholding ethical principles.
Okay, the next term is control, defined here as the manipulation of individuals to, like, silence dissent and maintain the status quo.
Right. Control in this context is about suppressing any opposition to those in power, making sure things stay the same. And that can happen in a lot of different ways, from outright censorship to more subtle forms of, like, pressure or manipulation that discourage people from speaking out or challenging those in charge.
Yeah, and it's often the more subtle forms that are the most insidious, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, media narratives is an interesting one, especially in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from so many sources. The material highlights how, whoever controls the flow of information has a huge influence on how the public perceives events and issues.
Oh, for sure. And that power can be used to shape opinions, deflect blame and maintain existing power structures. It underscores the importance of critical thinking skills and seeking out diverse perspectives and information sources.
Absolutely. The next term is unpunished, which points to the unequal consequences people face based on their social standing or connections. Like, some people seem to be able to get away with anything, while others are punished severely for minor infractions.
It's about the uneven application of the rules. When people in power or with influence can act with impunity while others face harsh penalties for similar actions, it completely undermines any sense of justice and fairness.
Okay, life-altering consequences is a powerful one. It's a reminder that the decisions people make, especially those in positions of authority, can have a profound impact on other people's lives.
And it's not just individuals, right?
Hmm.
Those decisions can affect whole communities. And that highlights the need for responsible, ethical leadership at all levels.
Absolutely. Okay, belittlement focuses on the psychological effects of putting others down, often for personal gain.
Right, belittlement is often used as a way to undermine someone's confidence in authority. It's a tactic to maintain control and a sense of superiority, and it can really damage the people on the receiving end.
Yeah, and it can also stifle creativity and innovation.
Yeah,
When people are constantly being put down, they're less likely to share their ideas or take risks.
totally.
And the last term on the list is utilization of individuals, which the material defines as seeing people as mere instruments to achieve your own goals without regard for their inherent worth.
And that's a pretty dehumanizing way to view other people.
Hmm.
When people are seen as just tools, it can lead to all sorts of exploitation and abuse. It's a fundamental violation of ethical principles in how we treat each other.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We started with those initial questions about personal conduct, and we ended up exploring these really insightful vocabulary terms that shed light on the complex dynamics of power in our society. And it's all connected. It all stems from those thought-provoking questions you sent us.
Hopefully, going through this process has given you some new perspectives and a deeper understanding of these important aspects of life and society. We certainly explored some challenging but really crucial areas.
Absolutely. So, as you reflect on all the things we've discussed today, everything from individual behavior to these larger systemic issues, and the language we use to describe power imbalances, what single action, if it were widely adopted, do you think could have the biggest positive impact on creating a more ethical and just world? It's a big question, but it's definitely worth pondering.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.